This is Books for Breakfast, a podcast where we talk about books and writing. I'm Enda Wiley.
And I'm Peter Sayre.
And you're all very welcome to this morning's show.
This morning's Books for Breakfast is a conversation with novelist, poet, essayist and former Irish fiction laureate Colm Tóibín about Ship in Full Sail, the Laureate Lectures and Other Writings, a collection of essays and lectures just published by Gallery Press. The book is a compilation of monthly blogs written for the Laureate website during Tóibín's 3-year tenure as Laureate for Irish Fiction, as well as 3 annual lectures given under the motto, The Art of Reading. The collection casts a pretty wide net. There's poetry, prose, discussions of writers, but also of artists and musicians, personal history, technology, AI, the intersection of politics and art, all making for a very lively collection. So, put the coffee on and we hope you enjoy this episode of Books for Breakfast.
Congratulations, Colm, on your new book, which has just been launched, and we both have been thoroughly enjoying reading it. And as Peter said, it's a pretty broad brush. You cover a lot of interesting ground in this collection, don't you? And they started out as blogs, and that was a new discovery for you, wasn't it, Colm?
Yeah, I would have viewed a blogger and a blog as being things that I was not going to get involved with. But I realised that if I did this every month, it would just be another thing, you know, that for the laureate thing to try and it was important that it was on the Arts Council website. It was the laureate part of the Arts Council website, which meant there were certain things you couldn't really write about. You know, you couldn't attack the Arts Council, for example. You couldn't really attack the Minister for Culture. You couldn't really write, like you say, detailed political polemic. Because really, you know, that you were under a different umbrella. And also I have every place to do that I want to. So in other words, I had to move into another area where I would try and be a bit more ruminative, a bit more just viewing things in a more long-term way, more personal, and also write about things that were to do with culture, where arguments within culture about, for example, fame, or about reading, you know, reading itself, or what is a novella, or where is John Broderick. And it was every month, so it really had to be in, I think, by the 28th to get. And what I discovered, to my amazement, was that no one had ever said how long a blog should be, and no one in the council bothered me about that. So at the beginning, they're more or less 1,200 words. But as I go on, like I'm here at night and I'm thinking, I have much more to say on this. Why don't I just keep going and see where it takes me? And so some of them are 2,500 words, which I think is probably too long for a blog. But I just thought, well, no, there's no one to stop me. So that's how they got going.
Yeah, I love that. I loved entering into your world and all the different things. It's kind of a collage, and it all comes together so seamlessly, really enjoyable.
Yeah, you came to Dublin from Wexford, and you write about those early days, and you write about that kind of sense of being an outsider and how that affected you. And you say that when you came to UCD, for instance, it was back in October 1972, you felt that people in Dublin were kind of laughing at you. Do you think that was true? Or was that just like your perception at the time?
Ronan Fanning, who was Professor of History at UCD, used to say, in a very boastful sort of way, that on the first day in Theatre M, he could tell the Gonzaga boys, he could tell the Belvedere boys, and he could tell the Clongowes boys. Now, coming from St. Peter's College, Wexford, I had no idea that this sort of hierarchy, that this sort of, where you would do a history degree, and then you would do the bar, and then you would become a junior counsel, and then you become a senior counsel, and you become a judge. And that was the trajectory of many. I had no idea what the bar was. Obviously, I thought a bar was a place where you went for drinks. But that you learn that Ireland, that this is not Trinity College, you know, this is not an old Protestant ascendancy. This is what Michael McDowell would call the sort of machine of the state at work. And certainly, you were being laughed at in a certain way for being from a small town. But the upper echelons of Dublin, walking around UCD as though they owned it, and they did own it, and their fathers had been there, their grandfathers had been there, and the thing was they all disappeared at around 6. They went home for their tea, and you didn't. Whereas people like me were to be found in the library until the moment it closed, basically because we had nowhere else to go.
I mean, because this was Dublin in the you know, you're just on the cusp of the 80s. I mean, what kind of place was it?
Well, I think in any city under those sort of pressures, you find your group. And if you have any bohemian tendencies, or you're homosexual, or you're interested in poetry, you find your group very quickly and you don't tend to move out of it. And every so often you get shocked deeply by people saying the rosary, or, contraception, Lord Charlie Haughey, or like those things. It's your group becomes, I think, all the more impenetrable because of the pressures from outside. And so you actually just find 2 or 3 pubs, just say Keogh's in South Anne Street, just say that a pub that's gone now called the Scotch House down on the Quays. And, you meet your friends and you really don't pay much attention to anything else that's going on, including the fact there's no central heating in your house, because nobody had central heating, except these barristers I'm talking about. There was no gas central heating in Dublin. And the pubs tended to close at 11 in the winter, 10 on a Sunday night, and 11:30 in the summer. And there really was nowhere else much to go after that. And no one I knew would keep wine in their houses or anything like that. So there was a lot of misery. Closing time really was the biggest form of open daily repression, being flung out of a pub when you were in mid-sentence. But the wider Catholic thing almost made no difference.
And hence all the couples kissing at the bus stops. Do you remember?
The last 46A, 11:30 on the dot. And if you missed it, I mean, nobody could afford a taxi. You just, like, if you missed the last 46A, trudging all the way out to Dunleary or somewhere from Trinity College. Yeah.
Yeah, in the rain.
But there was also like the 6-packs off to somebody. You would be following in a trail of people to somebody's flat. You wouldn't know where you were going.
Yeah, that's true, that people would have parties. And that's how I got a taste for Guinness, because every other drink would be gone. But there was always bottles of Guinness left, and you could just drink those, But,
I was just thinking about your early work as well, and, the drabness of Dublin. I remember that time, actually, because I went to college in the 80s. Did that feed into your first novel? Was the South, in a way, a reaction to that kind of drabness?
Yeah, I had tried to write short stories set around my own world of people who've been in UCD, who went into the civil service or went into teaching, and were now in their mid-20s, and were starting to give dinner parties. It really doesn't work. If for some reason that particular world doesn't yield, I mean, a novel of manners about that world, when people don't really have formed manners. That's why you get John McGahern's Dublin work. So it is the solitary existential hero. There's a marvellous moment, I think it's Joe O'Connor's Cowboys and Indians, where someone attempts to give a dinner party. And people just can't handle it. I mean, people get appallingly drunk, shout abuse at one another, turn up after closing time, for dinner, And so an attempt to write a sort of an Iris Murdoch novel about it set in that world really, it really does collapse. And I don't think anyone's ever done it. And so I'm back with it now, circling around a novel from that particular period. But I really have to get, like, there's no community. You can't write an English novel about a group of educated people attempting to run their lives in a serious city. You can't write that in Dublin. Things just collapse beautifully into comedy, mayhem, or just dullness, really.
Yeah, I remember John McGahern's My Love, My Umbrella. That was such a brilliant story.
Yeah, that's a pretty good version of it. The rain, the dampness, and the will we, won't we sex
that's
part.
Right. And then it all ends when the rain stops. Yeah. Brilliant story.
There's so many things that you touch on in this book. But one of the things that struck me was you have a piece about fathers and sons, and you talk about the kind of dynamics of that relationship. And you mentioned people like James Baldwin and Barack Obama even, but you describe Hamlet as a son made wayward by his father's death. And you talk about Samuel Beckett and his close relationship with his father. And he said of him after he died, "I can't write about him. I can only walk the fields and climb the ditches after him." And that's obviously a remark that resonated with you and with your own relationship, maybe with your own father.
Yeah, I think it begins with the moment where Fiona Shaw is playing, I suppose she's playing Antigone in the Oresteia, and she wonders about a moment where Orestes comes back from all the years away, and for a moment he pretends he's somebody else. And even though there's a great moment of recognition, he's joking. And she says, how do you play that? And my response to that was, you play it as that his father was murdered by his mother. He went away, he's stricken with grief, and the grief comes out as putting an antic disposition on. And that the Hamlet stuff comes from that, really, that idea that the figure becomes unsettled. And so you get this business of the dead father. And then you get this business of, for example, both Obama's autobiography, Dreams from My Father, and James Baldwin's first big autobiographical piece begin, the opening sentence is the moment when they heard their father had died. The second paragraph begins, my father was much blacker than I am. And my father, so that this business, it isn't just killing the father, it is to say, I rose because the father had gone. And then the question is there anyone at all whose relationship to their father is sweet? And then you realise, the strangest one of all is the Beckett one. And it's so well charted. Even in a story like Company, like a late story, trudging, he saw his father walking along together. And his father was a quantity surveyor, and every generation of the Becketts, or going back 3, say, produces one artist and one quantity surveyor. And they all seem to get on really well. Like this is a natural thing. There was May Beckett, there's Edward Beckett, who plays the flute. And not May Beckett, I mean the Sissy, who became Sissy Sinclair. She was a painter of the earlier generation. So Beckett and his father seemed not to have had a disagreement. Instead, they trudged throughout Dublin, going south on Sundays, big long walks.
Kind of silent walks.
Silent walks, but also it wasn't a tense silence. And it's a sort of remarkable idea that out of that ease, he got such levels of unease, And of course, when his father dies very young, and he's left with his mother, then it causes him, then the tension is really there between him and his mother. But nonetheless, when he told his mother he wanted to be an art critic, his mother said, well, how do you do that? And he said, well, I would have to go to Germany for a year and look at paintings. And she funded that, which is more than mine did, I have to say. More than perhaps yours did either.
But I thought that line, though, I can't write about him, I can only walk the fields and climb the ditches. It's poetry. It's so beautiful. I was really glad to read that in Ship in Full Sail.
Ah, beautiful. It's really beautiful.
And I heard Banville as well talking about the fact that when his father died, he became a man then as well. So, but speaking about Banville, I know there's a lot of writers in this book that have been important to you. And actually, some books I hadn't even heard of, so I'm excited to read them. But you have a piece here about discovering Birchwood by Banville. And what did that novel mean to you when you first encountered it?
Birchwood was a huge moment. It's hard to think about it now, but it was so beautifully written and it was so easy to misunderstand because it could look like another Irish big house novels. It was the epoch of, there were 2 or 3 books that really were being mentioned in the Irish Times almost every day. And one was Jennifer Johnson's Captains and the Kings and her second novel, The Gates. And the other was J.G. Farrell's Troubles. And so it looked like as though the big house novel was back in and we all should be thinking about it and, thinking about that tradition. And Banville published Birchwood, which ostensibly looked like there were people in a big house. But of course, it's all parody. I mean, in other words, there is a famine, perhaps, or there is a circus, or there may be both. These characters have names, but the names are hardly read. When he wants to get rid of Granny Godkin, he blows her up, but that's not original. That's in Bleak House. And I remember him laughing about no one in Dublin having read Bleak House. It was one of those big novels that no one seemed to have read. And he himself, even in the way he got photographed, had this sardonic Black Forest look. And
you talk about his sour muffled laughter at the world. I thought that was very good. Yeah. And he's very distinctive in his approach to language and narrative structure and reality and illusion even.
Yeah, he came to UCD when I was 18 and he talked about the novel. And he wanted to really break the whole business asunder of it being a mirror or it being realistic or there being characters that were true to life or turning the page. He thought all that was just over. And he was invoking Nabokov and various people, but he was really just trying to destroy things, saying it's over. And then he invited some of us out to his house on a Sunday. Well, I was absolutely extraordinary. His first child and Janet himself were there, and he had made the cradle himself. The house was on Howth, overlooking everything. And of course, what he had to do then was drive us back into town because he was going into as a sub-editor into the Irish Press. He had to be in by 5. And it was a Sunday, and he just said, you don't understand what this is like. And I felt those books like Kepler and Dr. Copernicus were really about that. business of being a genius and having to deal with the ordinary way, like the dullness or so it was a fascinating experience to see him like that. And we were reminiscing. I mean, this is more than 50 years ago. This is 52 years ago. And we were reminiscing just recently about, he said to me, you have to have been really young then. I said, well, so are you, He was really young.
So I remember reading the Newton Letter as well around that time, and he said that was one of his favourite books. It was such a beautiful little book. And speaking of little books, you've described in Ship in Full Sail the novella as a kind of ideal form. It's almost a perfection. But you also said it might be something that nobody wants. Could you say a bit more about that?
If you think about the great ones, the great novellas, Heart of Darkness, The Turn of the Screw. I mean, Tolstoy has a few, Haji Murad and the Death of Ivan Ilyich. And the ideal is it's about 25,000 words. It's about 100 pages. And if it isn't those ones I've mentioned, it can be pretty dull, because just as you're getting into it, you see, it doesn't require plot. It doesn't require any change of the characters. It just involves a journey or some sort of thing that happens. So it's like a tale. And the point is that when that's tedious, it's very tedious. And therefore, there's no publisher longing for someone to write a novella. I mean, maybe Ian McEwan's On Chesil Beach is a pretty good example.
Yeah, or Claire Keegan.
Well, yeah. I think Claire Keegan makes a very good distinction between Foster and Small Things Like These, because in Small Things Like These you do get a sort of backstory for the character where he was adopted, and he finds out in the novel who his father really was, and that makes it a sort of novel in that there's a primary plot and there's a second one below, which doesn't happen in Foster. So therefore you used to call Foster as a novella. But what's a novella? A novella is someone no one wants until they do.
Until they do it well. Like John McGahern, he did it very well in The Country Funeral, and you write about that as well. And McGahern, it was turned down by a lot of magazines, wasn't it?
Yeah, he gave it to me as though it was new and he'd just finished it. And I believed that. And we talked about it. But when the letters came out, I realised, by the time he gave it to me, it was about 10 years old. It just had been returned by everybody. And he just had it at home. And there was someone there from the BBC, and he gave it to us both. But then I photocopied, and we read it. And I thought it was an extraordinary piece of work. And it's only now come out on its own here. It's a little book for Faber. But in France, it came out on its own at the time. And but the problem was he published it in a collected stories without it ever appearing in a book. And as a result, very few people have actually read it. And it's lovely having a lovely story that most people haven't read, but your reputation is very high. But this is still to come, as it were. It's beautifully structured. It's his Stoneybatter book.
Beautiful, beautiful. I have actually read it, and the other thing I was going to say is you have a novella as well coming out. Do you? Are we allowed to say that? Or
it's almost the same thing where I really put a lot of work into this story called A Long Winter. To the extent that I went up to the Pyrenees at the time of year where it's set, and all the weather, all the walks every day were done as I was writing the story. In those winter months, probably it was just 20 years ago now, and it appeared at the end of a book called Mothers and Sons, and I never met anyone who read it. People just missed it. And people buy books of stories and they read a few stories and they get bored, and then they certainly don't read the last one. So why I put it there, I don't know. And it was hidden, and so I sort of slowly cajoled, I think is the word, lured the publisher into reissuing it on its own as a book.
But it looks lovely, and I'm looking forward to reading it.
There are lots of writers, obviously, in this collection, and I was very taken with your encounters with Eugene McCabe. And I was wondering, what kind of man was he, and what do you value about his writing?
Oh, you see, when I knew him first, he wasn't writing at all. He was writing the Reardons, and he felt very bad. And everyone was always trying to get him to write something. Brian Friel was always trying to get him to write a play, but everyone was at him all the time over what's happening to you. And I felt that what was happening was that whatever was going on just outside his window, which was the north, which was the killings of a lot of UDR men along that border region, with the IRA crossing the border very close to Eugene's house at one point on his land. And that was eating away at him because he wasn't a nationalist, and he had no... his politics were close to that of anyone normal, in the sense that he just thought the killing was awful, and he thought the two parts of the island perhaps should be more together, but not in that way, And So it was it wasn't don't mention not writing to Eugene. It came up a lot in conversation. And at one point I told him that I had bumped into McGahern, who was just talking about how much he admired his work. And Eugene would say to me, almost, that's so encouraging. I really feel I should go back to work hearing that. This is over a very long period of time,
And wasn't this around the time he was writing Death and Nightingales?
Yeah. So he started to write Death and Nightingales, but I'm talking about the previous decade, So he wrote it in his indecipherable longhand, and then Eugene couldn't type, no one could read it, so Eugene did it onto a dictaphone, and he gave it to a professional typist in Monaghan or Cavan or somewhere. And that typist could not do, it didn't and wasn't or all one, there's no, apostrophes. That could not do punctuation or apostrophes. And it looked awful. But there was nothing he could do. So he said, I was over at Anna McCarrick, and he must have called, and I drove over. And a few times I would stay the night, but usually just have dinner or just sit around. He was very sardonic. He took a great interest in his neighbours. And he had no bitterness about his own position. Like he was a very tolerant fellow, And maybe he sent a copy to McGahern as well, or no. I actually sent it to, anyway. Whatever it was, I read it, and I know exactly where I was, what sofa I was sitting on, and I was really, and I know what I wrote to him. I wrote to him to say, for the rest of your life, this book is going to, everyone you meet is going to come up to you. Everybody, you go. Do you understand? And the problem then was he had no publisher. He had no relationship to anyone, and so it was a question of finding the right person for him. And he had done with the book called 32 Counties, he had done one of the essays for Robin Robertson, who at the time was in Secker, I think, but it was part of the Random House group. And I know a few publishers in England wanted to publish it. So, and that's how that happened, isn't it? About the technology, like his handwriting, but it was indecipherable.
And for all its errors, you said that it will be read a century from now, and it will be. It was one of the finest.
Yeah.
And also, talking about Tyrone Guthrie and Anna McCarrick, you were there at the launch in 1981, and there's a great description of, meeting Brian Field spoke at it, and then Brian Field and Eugene McCabe talking about Guthrie and how he had this really strong interest in their work. He'd ask you a question about your work, you'd respond, he'd remember, come back to you again, and that he made writers feel that it was very important what they were doing.
And we're standing in the hall, and I've no reason to be there, and they just don't tell me to go away, so I just stick it out, and they start to talk about Tyrone Guthrie. And they say, both of them, do you miss him? And one of them says, yeah, all the time, because everything I write I want him to see. And then they say, wasn't it amazing what he did, that he would meet you and think you'd some talent and ask you what you were doing and then remember that. And of course, he brought Friel to America. Friel's first outing really was to work, to be for a year while he was working in Philadelphia, in one of those in Minneapolis or in the, and with Eugene, he would invite Eugene over, and of course King of the Castle, Eugene wrote one great novel, one great play, and one great collection of stories, and so, but they both talked about. I was very surprised that either of them, especially Friel, would talk like that about anybody else who had had such an effect on him, and that's what they both said.
And it's extraordinary because when you go to Anna McCarrick, it's so rural, and yet there was all this creative work going on, and he was a powerhouse of support for artists, wasn't he, Guthrie?
Yeah, and he was also, he was Chancellor of Queen's, and when he made his speech about United Ireland, where he thought the border was just madness, they wanted to remove him, and he was very independent minded, and of course he had a lot of money.
I was thinking about other encounters in the book. There was a memorable encounter with Salman Rushdie and a memorable walk in house. But I remember because it was the time he was in Dublin, and I was working in the Writer Centre at the time, and I was told there's a man coming to the centre tomorrow, and you're not to tell anyone, and there's going to be a press conference, and it's Salman Rushdie and all that. And don't even tell. I didn't even tell Enda.
Yeah, I was shocked by this. I didn't know who was going to be there.
But they didn't tell the press either, because so when he came, he was there in the room upstairs. And there was me, there was Theo Dorgan, and I think there was somebody from Radio na Gaeltachta, and there was nobody else. Yeah. So it was just very bizarre. But you describe.
I know I had the most terrible idea. I mean, really, what you have to realise is that a lot of writers really don't care about nature. And Martin Amis, for example, really doesn't write about the sea or, fields. And Salman Rushdie loves Bombay. He loves New York. He's a cat. And but I didn't think about that. I just thought he must be cooped up a lot. And wouldn't it be lovely if he went for a walk in one of the most beautiful places on earth, which is the summit in Howth. But it was a January day. It was a beautiful Saturday, really beautiful. Because we were going to get dark early. I remember we went out first to Howth, where we met Nell McCafferty in some bar. And then with the cops, we walked over the summit in Howth. Only two things interested him, really. The first was, is it always as windy as this? Yeah. And the second one was, he was absolutely fascinated by this was where Conor Cruise O'Brien lived. He didn't say, who are you and why but it was completely unnecessary. And the cops were I mean, it was to bring someone like that to somewhere as open as that was also a mistake. But I think he enjoyed the rest of his trip. There was a lunch for him in the Arts Council, and which Dermot Bulger organised. And
wasn't there another story about you being in a taxi with him on the way to Cheltenham? And was it you said that he hadn't finished? Was it Middlemarch? Was it?
He's never read Middlemarch. It's an absolute disgrace. But you see, he was around a lot in London. And he always had his bodyguards with him, and they were in the company. I mean, it was so tight. I presume there were one or two at the door. They were armed. And one of them was doing a PhD in literary theory. And I mean, he really was reading, serious Baudrillard and, everybody else and Derrida. And he was a cop. And the other guy had won a competition for a complete outfit free from Esquire. And I worked for Esquire. So it was just great. I won the competition. And then I claimed to, of course, be involved with the competition, which I wasn't. And, but it did happen that a lot of people got to know those cops very, very well, because the same people really gathered in the same place to be with him around that time. And so we're going to Cheltenham in the car. And of course, he just wants to look out the window and get left alone. And then I really fancy one of the cops, the one who won the competition. He knows who he is. And so we're having a great time flirting about literature and flirting about Esquire and talking about and Salman's just, I feel for once he's being completely ignored. And that suits him in the sense that everywhere else he goes, people stare at him wondering what it's like to have a price on your head. I felt, but of course, how would I know what he was thinking? But I felt as he was looking out the window and we were just high on some issue to do with, literary something. And we'd all read Middlemarch, and how come he hadn't?
I was interested in another Irish writer you talk about, John Broderick, as an almost invisible gay novelist or a novelist of gay life in Ireland. And he had the great misfortune, I think, to be banned because you call his novels shadow books which might have mattered. But of course, the censorship laws banned The Pilgrimage and they effectively wrecked his career. Do you think his voice is hearable now, or does anyone read him?
No, the novels are no good, really, but they would have mattered. In other words, they were banned, but so was Edna O'Brien, so was John McGahern. But they weren't reissued after 1967. Now, there's a novel called The Pilgrimage, and I was very surprised when Lawrence Stein, who's doing this series really of gay books for McNally Jackson, and they're sort of cutting edge, trying to revive a lot of books like that, he emailed to say, would I write an introduction to a John Broderick novel? And like this, he's gone from he's leaped over himself almost from being sort of unread to being in this sort of New York reissue series. And the Pilgrimage is really like the old Catholic bigot is lying in bed, but he's gay. His wife is having an affair with this sort of servant, and there are loads of gay people wandering around. Now, I didn't know this book existed. So in other words, if in the same time as I read The Barracks or The Dark or The Country Girls, if that book had been around as well, it would have mattered because there would have been some sort of mirror to look into if you were gay, where there was a book about an ordinary Midlands family. No, well, they're not ordinary, but they're in the Midlands family, where homosexuality is a really crucial part of the drama of their lives. And that book was not available. It was not reissued. So it's not, the other books became famous, partly because they were banned, but also because they were good. So I thought it was the most curious business that he had pretty bad luck. He had a big bestseller with a novel called An Apology for Roses. But he also was a terrible crank. It's a great example, in a way, of someone writing horrible reviews.
In Hibernia, I remember.
In Hibernia, yeah. Really intemperate. And he disliked everything. And so his very name suggested a sort of, but nonetheless, since it was nothing about contemporary homosexuality, it was presumed there was nothing written. And of course, that's never true. There always is. And here was the Irish one, and it wasn't available. It's a curious business, that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really, really strange.
Of course, it was also helped that he was the only one of them who had a private income. Because he owned all the bread eaten in the Midlands. It was owned by Broderick's Bread, Broderick's Bakery,
But the book was full of music, and music clearly matters to you. And you write beautifully about, for instance, Beethoven's late quartets and how you discover them. I think it was when you met the American cellist Miriam Rader in Barcelona. Can you just tell us about that encounter?
Yeah, there was an Irish friend, and he had a girlfriend who was a cellist called Miriam Rader, and she eventually ended up in Mallorca as part of the symphony orchestra there. But herself and a few friends had fixed up a house in the American style, meaning a lot of light and a lot of nice bright colours, in a place called Vulpellac, north of Barcelona in the Empordà, just in the province of Girona. And I went into a room, and it was floor to ceiling Deutsche Grammophon LPs of classical music. It must have cost, it's been shipped from America, that sort of money. And I couldn't believe what she had. And most of it I'd never heard, but nonetheless, look at this. Because LPs in Ireland were very expensive, and people didn't have a collect. Maybe your parents might have some, but you're certainly even buying a rolling, for Christmas. And that's when I first heard, because I remember I came downstairs and said, I think that looks as though the wrong thing has been put in to the sleeve, in other words, the wrong pressing or something, because it sounded 20th century. And it was probably Opus 131 or 132, but probably Opus 131, where it just was going all over the place. It wasn't adhering to the sonata structure, and it seemed much wilder and stranger. And she said, "Oh, that's welcome to the club. That's the Beethoven late quartets." And then it started. I could borrow them in Barcelona. Then you could borrow records from the British Institute. So I borrowed them, and then I bought them, and then I've been with them ever since. Really.
And also, you've a really striking moment where you're listening to the Tokyo String Quartet, and it's playing Opus 74 in New York, and you suddenly become aware of mortality, and you suddenly start thinking, well, there will come a time when you won't be alive to hear the music. And that's a really kind of deep experience, isn't it?
Yeah, I've never had it the same, as sharp as that, where you're listening to it and it's seriously beautiful. And this has been there for 200 years. And it will be there, presumably, into the future, but you won't be here. And not only you won't be here, but there'll be no you to be here. And there'll even be no you not to be here. There'll be no you-ness in you. And it will be as though you've never been, really. And you can say those in words, and it seems like, but to get that in full as a feeling. And that was Tokyo, quite I don't know what.
It's very profound, isn't it, that feeling?
Well, it's very simple as well, you see. It's just sharp and simple, but when it comes to as absolute, it should, of course, come to us all the time, but we have various ways of distracting ourselves. That's what poetry does, really, isn't it?
There's so much other, but there's so much other music as well. You talk about the raw, wild singing of Caistlín Maud. You talk about Joe Heaney, traditional singer. You talk about Bernard Creevy. You talk about Bob Dylan, and you also talk about Iarla Ó Lionáird and that very interesting encounter in place. You know well, Enda.
Oh, yeah, I do know. But it was fun to read about that, and you going down there I think it was around 1986, and Pather meets you, was it off the bus? Pather Reither, and he says, "Oh, here's the man from Dublin."
We'd know you. The whole business of, I know we'd no trouble recognising you off the bus. Sure, you're the great look of a fella from Dublin. And I then start, I'm not from Dublin. But we were having an interesting conversation. We heard the highest pub in Ireland is called Top of Colm, isn't it? And someone...
Yeah, we were just saying that it was called the Topacoom because Eileen Topacoom had a big black bun, and that's why it made it so high. So there was always great crack to be had there. Yeah,
it was higher than, and then they wouldn't let you buy you around, and you'd realise, oh my God, there are 10 people here. Are we really going to drink 10 pints? And I think that all that changed soon after, but people did drink 10 pints, and I nearly died.
You had a rule, though, no puking and no fading.
Yeah, it was a Bernard Loughlin and myself in trips to Spain and trips generally. No puking, no fading.
it's a great rule, isn't it? And you've carried it through life, haven't you? Yeah. Also, I like the bit where, you know, spontaneous singing would begin, but it looked spontaneous, but it's not. Everyone knew where they were coming in. And then some history professor sang Rachel's song. And, you know, afterwards they're going, that was Rachel's song.
Yeah, we're down in some, I think we're down in Joy's or one of those nightclubs because it's been given over to us. Noel Pearson produced the Oria the weekend. And so it's the Oria people and their friends have been given a nightclub just to, you know, and Dermot Desmond has paid for this, I think. And so we're all there and suddenly, yeah, this, actually it's Johnny Murphy sings a song and it sounds fine. And, you know, someone says to me, oh, you know, do you see what just happened? And it's that lovely hierarchy, that lovely set of rules. And I go, oh, that's Rachel's song. He sang Rachel's song. And they presumed that he would know, you know. And I love that business of singing where you, if you can't, like I can't sing, so you don't sing, do you know.
And that people owned a song, you know, it was part of them, you know. But Colm, we have to ask you about poetry, okay, before we go. So, Peter, do you want to start off there on?
Yeah, because obviously, like it's clearly important for you, and you know that, and you write about it, and you've written. I mean, the last time we talked to you on the podcast, we talked about your collection, Vinegar Hill. So where does that come from? Where does the interest in poetry come from?
It comes from my mother, I suppose. My mother wrote poetry before she married, and she had a poem in the local paper, and it was taken up by someone on the Irish press to say, this is the sort of poetry that's now been published in our provincial newspapers. And, you know, it published it in full. And I think it had just had her initials. You know, people would do that when she published it first. But, of course, she cut it out and put it in the backs of all sorts of books and things. And so she read poetry, and she, in later years, using the library, found all sorts of things that she liked, including Wallace Stevens. You know, and I mean, she was a serious reader of poetry, and she knew things off by heart. I mean, you know, the usual things at the time, like early Yeats and bits of Shakespeare and all that.
And Kipling. Kipling is.
Oh, yeah. I'm in a train going out of Paddington, I suppose, to Cheltenham, and I'm with Sebastian Barry, and I realise that he has whatever laptop, it's connected still to the internet, to Heaven on High, and it's come into my mind after all the years, lines, and that must be how the big things pass and the little things remain, like the smell of the wattle in Lichtenberg, and I didn't know what something in the rain. I said, could you just, like, what could that be? Lichtenberg. And Sebastian was interested because it was, that must be why the big things pass and the little things remain. And so he sort of said it, and then we looked at it, and it was Kipling. And it's an Australian soldier is in South Africa in those years, you know, early 20th century. And he says, and that must be why the big things pass and the little things remain, like the smell of the wattle in Lichtenberg riding in the rain. It's amazing riding in. It's a big risk to take, isn't it? Riding in the rain.
Yeah,
and Lichtenberg is a place in South Africa. And there it was, where my mother got it from. But she would say it in a dreamy way, wandering around the kitchen, that must be why. And then my father died in 1967 and when I was going to secondary school. And so every evening I would, meant to be studying in the front room, the parlour. And I started to write poetry almost on the first night of that in September 1967. And I sent a lot of poems out, aged 14 or 15. And the problem is that archive is a terrible business where the Capuchins have an archive, and they had a magazine called Eirig, and they published, Eirig was meant to be it was taking teenagers seriously by the Capuchins. And there was a really good priest called Donal O'Mahony. And, but they wrote back to me and they published some poems, sent me postal orders, and, but they have everything I sent them seemingly in an archive, everything. Which is really nightmare. I mean, really nightmare. And Peter Fallon has the same, as far as I understand. But I wrote Peter a lot of letters, and he replied to them. And so I was this little fellow writing poetry when no one else was. And the big shock, the really big shock, was coming to UCD to find Aidan Matthews was already writing Aidan Matthews poems, ironic, sophisticated, stanza-led poems when I arrived, and there was also Gerard Fanning, and they were all publishing in the Irish press almost everything they sent David Marcus. He might send back one poem, but he'd use another. And only later did he publish one poem of mine. But all that period, like when I'm in UCD, he doesn't. And I just get them. I would send a Stanford Dress envelope, and they would just come back. For a while, I pasted them on the wall, all the rejections from the Irish press. But that grew very embarrassing. There were also other people writing poems then in UCD. There was a fellow called Patrick King in UCD, and he published a pamphlet with the Honest Ulsterman. And he died. He died suddenly of a brain hemorrhage. But he was really on his way somewhere. In the sense that he was in one of those Faber introductions. He was in one of the Faber introductions, and so I knew him very well. But we talked only poetry. And the big moment really was the Snow Party. And that was really, that really woke everyone up to the various things that, woke me up to the various things I couldn't do, But there was the Snow Party more than North, oddly enough, even though I was at the first reading of North. But it was the Snow Party that opened the way, I think.
But I think, I can remember the enormous effect of Mahan's work, like the Snow Party.
Yeah, looking over London, rain-washed in the morning light, what middle-class cons we are, like that.
Which, of course, was revised.
He couldn't go on with that. But
terrible man for revising the work, actually.
But I'm going home by sea for the first time in years, and he's talking about a single light on the deck. It's all, that book,
I was really interested in the world of painting that comes up in this book, Ship in Full Sail. You were writing about Irish artists like Louis Le Brocquet and Patrick Scott, Tony O'Malley, Barry Cook, Patrick Collins, as well as, it has to be said. Yeah, and also Catalan painters like Joaquin Mir and Aziz Rain O'Neill. And you have a significant focus as well on Eileen Gray, and the challenges of preserving her legacy. But they, I think, touch upon really the essence of artistic creation and making a mark. And I love that bit when you were writing the South and you thought, I'm going to research. So what'll I do? I'm going to get Barry Cook and I'm going to talk to him. But how does he do that? You didn't call him or anything. Sure, you didn't call him. You just...
Well, I knew Barry via Aidan Dunn, who, was writing about art. And Barry Cook was a serious reader. So if you met him anywhere or even went up to him, he would be whatever book he was just reading. Patrick Collins put me onto the Newton letter. It just come out, and he saw it in Hodges Fidgets, and he couldn't believe the shape of it. And he bought it. He was savouring it. Just savouring holding it. And so I must have been in the old David Hendricks Gallery on Stephen's Green, and I must have found Barry. Actually, no, I wrote a piece about Barry, and therefore I met him to do that. But I asked him, looking at one of his paintings, how did you start that? How do you start? I mean, what I meant was, do you sketch? Do you have a full plan? Like, how do you do that gesture if it's planned? And he said, no, it's not that really, that you have the canvas and you have it there and you have paint, and you start by making a mark. And I then, of course, clunky questioner, say, what if the mark is wrong? I do all that. He said, no, it always comes from somewhere. That you make that mark and not another one has to come from something. But you don't question that or analyse it. You just do it. And that became, for me, a sort of way of working.
And then didn't it feed into novels like The South and, and then Ballyconneger?
Yeah, it broke open a space but I mean, it opened something, because I would have felt that Wexford coast, that 5 miles of Wexford coast, you could not get anything from it other than a few, lyric poems maybe at the most, and Tony O'Malley had painted a bit of it. But as a novel, how would you get a drama from that? So I was stuck with the South, and I was working on a manual typewriter, and I said, I'm going to make a mark. I'm going to close my eyes, I'm going to stop. And when I'm ready, I'm going to just bang on the typewriter. And what I banged was the sea, a grey shine on the sea. And that sea was Ballyconnecker, and I had never thought of it before as anything I could use for any purpose.
That's such a sparsely populated space, and yet from that would come.
Yeah. And from that I got a huge amount of stuff.
It's like nearly the absences, isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't that what you say? That from that came it.
Yeah.
I thought that was a brilliant connection. And I often think of that as poetry as well. If you can make that mark, you've made it, and it will lead you somewhere you least expect. Isn't that it?
Yeah, and with Patrick Collins, it was that he had no real interest in going back to Sligo. He lived in France and he lived in various parts of Dublin, but it was the memory. And the memory gave him enough to work from, but it didn't come all the time. It wasn't nostalgia. It was some image of light and mist and something that came to him and that he could work from. But he actually made very little work. So it's not as though, at any moment you could summon it. It came maybe as a poem might come, unbidden and unexpected. And here it is again,
And also there's a brilliant story about Tony O'Malley and the suitcase. Will you tell that, Colm? Because it is so interesting.
Tony O'Malley went around a lot of those provincial towns in the southeast as a bank clerk. And he told me that he was even ashamed to be seen painting. And he was drinking a lot. And then on Sundays, he would go outside Enniscorthy, hiding all the stuff he had, meaning he was doing watercolours and gouaches and works with crayon and with pencil. And, he moved from place to place. He was in Arklow, he was in New Ross, and then he was in Enniscorthy. And he stayed in Hayes's in Court Street in Enniscorthy. And my Auntie Harriet knew him, and a friend of hers called Ida Moriarty even did a line with him. And so that was all known. But he then went to St. Ives. So he didn't come back to Enniscorthy until the 80s, when he had a show called, I think, Between Two Worlds or Within Two Worlds, which was the Irish painting and the Cornwall paintings. And he was just walking in Enniscorthy, and he met one of the Hayes girls, one of the daughters of the house, and Tony. And it was more than almost 40 years. And she said, by the way, that suitcase you left is still in the attic. And when he had married Jane, and Jane they were looking more, I suppose, systematically at his work. Whereas there's a lot of work missing. There are years when there's no small work, and work on paper, and they're all to the brim and all intact. And a lot of it even still hasn't been shown because there was so much of it. And that's how Tony O'Malley got all that work back. It's all, all around Enniscorthy, Vinegar Hill, all those places, piled to the top.
In that suitcase.
In that suitcase.
That's a good end to the conversation. So, thank you very much, Colm Tóibín, for joining us at the breakfast table this morning to discuss Ship in Full Sail, the laureate lectures and other writings, just published by the Gallery Press, and details, as always, on booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com.
Thank you so much, Colm.
Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you.
I think we've reached the end of our Books for Breakfast podcast this morning. I'm definitely rushing off to have more coffee. And I'm Enda Wiley, and I have Peter Sir here with me. And Peter, would you like to tell everyone about the details of the podcast if they'd like to listen again?
Well, you can subscribe at all the usual sources, Google and Apple and so on. And if you want to check out the notes that go along with this podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. And so
we'll be back again. We'll have the toast on, we'll have the kettle boiling, we will have more books to discuss, and we're looking forward to having you here. So goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.